Welcome back. Thank you to everyone who was able to join when we had our guest speaker talk to us. Um, Isaac brought up a lot of great points based on his practice experience, and I hope you all enjoyed that, learned something from it. And as he mentioned, feel free to reach out to him if you have questions about what he does, one of the cases he's working on, etc. So today we're going to talk about rules versus standards. So when we, being a society, you may specifically think about the government, when we set rules to live by, standards, we have to decide what form those will take. And one simple distinction we can make is between a rule that sets kind of a black line, this is what you're allowed to do. You are not allowed to drive faster than 55 miles per hour on this stretch of road. That is a clear rule. Compared to a standard, which is a much more ambiguous sort of way to set a guideline. So a standard would say something like, you must drive reasonably. So there's no clear, explicit, this is what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. Instead, with a standard, we're going to base your behavior on some element of a fuzzy sort of concept like you must do something reasonably or you must act in good faith. So these are terms that we often see in contracts, and we'll talk about them more when we're talking about contract law. But it's worth thinking about now when we're talking about torts, because as we, as a society, try to set up our legal structure, this is a choice that is often available. So if you're the Environmental Protection Agency charged with protecting the environmental quality of our air and water and soil and such, you could set a standard that says factories cannot release an unreasonable amount of pollution. So that would be a standard. It's ambiguous, right? There's no clear line in the sand. Now, if instead the EPA says you're not allowed to release more than 8 parts per million of methyl alkylide into the water, that's a rule, right? There is an explicit, in that case quantitative, you're not allowed to do more than this. Now, both of those have their appeal. So having something that is clear, that is black letter, you may not do this thing. If you do that or worse, then you have violated the law. There's benefit to that because it's clear, it's easy to understand. It also tends to be relatively easy to enforce. To prove that a factory polluted too much, you have to show that they had higher than 8 parts per million concentration of this compound in their releases into the water. We take a water sample, it shows 14 parts per million, that's higher than 8, they violated it. So proof, evidence tends to be relatively easy if we're talking about rules. And again, expectations are easier to set. It's clear, it's easier for people to understand what's allowed and what's not allowed. On the other hand, the world is full of really complex situations, and people have to adapt on the fly to things all the time. And that can be really hard with rules. That's where standards really shine, right? Telling people they have to act reasonably is easy standard to set ahead of time. Because we can say, yeah, we're not going to be able to necessarily predict what kind of situation a doctor is confronted with when they have an unruly patient who's trying to break out of the hospital and maybe harming other people, right? It's a really tough situation. It really depends on that patient, how strong they are, what they're in the hospital for in the first place, how they're trying to hurt other patients. Those things all really matter. So we may not be able to ahead of time say, well, if this, and this happens, we want the people in charge to do exactly this. That would be a situation where we probably want to have a standard that says when doctors are confronted with violent, unruly patients, they need to act in reasonable ways, right? So setting a standard for them, it gives them the flexibility to adapt to a situation, to respond to it. Now, it's easy to set that ahead of time, right? But we notice after the fact, if we need to prove that a doctor did not act reasonably in this situation, getting evidence for that is tough. Basically, what we'll have to do is we'll have to go talk to a bunch of other doctors, ask them what they think would be reasonable response in that sort of situation. And if the doctor in our case didn't meet that standard, then we would have some evidence that they were not reasonable. But it's going to take a lot of gathering after the fact to figure out where exactly that fuzzy line is in a case with these particular facts. The other unfortunate thing about standards, again, they have lots of flexibility. I talk about it as kind of fuzzy. That means it's a lot harder to understand exactly where that line is. If you're, someone who likes to live by the letter of the law in every situation, you know that if you drive over 55 miles per hour on this stretch of road, then you are speeding and you are breaking the law. So you know how to not speed. You can drive 55, or to be careful, maybe 53 or 54, right? You know how to guide your behavior to not violate the law if it is a clear rule. The standard part, if you can't drive in an unsafe manner given the conditions, that's a standard, right? It's fuzzy. It's a lot harder to know, well, okay, it's raining right now. Does that mean I could drive probably 45 or 50 as long as it's rainy but I can still see fairly well? Or does that mean, no, I should really be backing down to about 35, 40 miles per hour on this stretch of road? It's a lot harder. It depends on the conditions. It's harder to know ahead of time what behavior would be okay and what's not, because there's this gray area in between. So that's how we think about rules and standards. Rules could be really nice for setting expectations, for proving violations after the fact, but it's hard to have rules to capture all of the complicated situations in life. There's also an element of, if we're going to set rules for everything, that's a lot of government getting into specifics about behavior. That's much more what the civil law countries do. So if you think of continental Europe, they have codes to deal with all kinds of behavior. And those codes lay out a bunch of contingencies. If this happens, then you need to do this. If this and this happen, then instead you act this way. They try to set out a lot of rules for a lot of different situations. But that means the government is setting a bunch of standards for behavior. One benefit of standards and a common law system like we have in the US or like they have in England is that instead of the government deciding what we should be doing and setting the standards for behavior, we actually get normal citizens involved in the process, sitting as jurors, deciding, was this reasonable in this case or not? So that's something else our guest lecturer talked about, was picking jurors from the population who actually have the ability to craft our law by deciding a particular case in front of them, but that's setting precedent for other cases going forward. So the standards to guide our behavior are coming as more of a bottom-up approach, in the sense that we have everyday people acting as jurors who are helping decide what's reasonable and what's not in particular situations. Well, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.